So in this video, we have our basic layers set up. We have all of our renders out of Photoshop stacked up with the correct blending modes. Selecting all of those and grouping them together and just calling them base layers. Now at this stage we're ready to start adding overlays on top, so I'll grab some of these dirty wall textures here. Just select them and then copy and paste them on top of our base layers and set the blending mode to overlay. Now that wall texture is overspraying on the background as well, so I actually want to get rid of that. Now the easiest way to do that is we'll just scale and rotate and place this texture in a way that's appealing on the head. I'm just using transform, just Control T, just to transform this. And then I will hue saturation shift it. I can adjust the lightness and the saturation here, and it gives me a nice warmer brown just to start blocking this out with. Now I will Control click on any of the BPR renders, and that will select the pixels of the head. Control Shift I will invert that selection, and I can delete then any pixels that are not directly on top of the head. Now at this stage I'm going to turn off the background layer. I'm going to turn off the overlay and then press Control Alt Shift E to collapse the visible layers into a new layer. And we're going to call that Base Layers Collapse. That's just the gray shaded layers with all the shadows on top collapsed into a single layer. And then I'll use Control U to bring up hue saturation. I'm going to shift the color of this. So instead of putting our overlays on top of a gray shaded base, we're going to do one that's slightly hue shifted just to get a little bit of a tint to it. Remember, that's Control Alt Shift E, and that will collapse all your visible layers into a new layer while keeping the layers that you're basing it off of. So I'll turn my background back on there now, pasting in an overlay again, positioning the overlay, and then I'll Control click on the Base Layer Collapse, Control Shift I to invert that selection, and I can then delete the overspray. So now I'm just getting that overlay on top of the skin of the head. I'm using the eraser brush to erase out bits of that texture. I don't want it to be a completely uniform coverage. I want it to be more broken up and sort of random. And we're basically going to be stacking these types of overlays. The best way I can describe this is experiment with stacking them and changing your blending modes between hard light, soft light, and overlay, as you see me doing here, because each one of those will give you a slightly different effect. And then you can change your color balance with Control B, or your hue saturation with Control U. So here I'm just hue shifting using the color balance control. These menus are available under the image menu, but I just use the hotkeys to access them just for speed. Again, erasing out parts that I feel like are too bold. And these random textures that we're getting from photographs of walls and rocks and different textures, they allow you to create a very chaotic, broken up, very natural skin texture, skin coloration variation, without having to paint it manually. It's very hard to plan chaos, but you can get that chaos out of a photograph from nature. Also, don't forget that you can adjust your opacity on the layers as well. You see that I just dialed back the opacity on that particular overlay layer just to make it a little bit less overstated. It was a little bit too strong. Here I am selecting the eyes, the eye base, and I'm erasing those out. And I just don't want there to be too much of a texture overlay on the eyes because we're going to be painting those later. And again, hue shifting. At this early stage, I do a lot of experimentation with shifting of the hues. And because I keep my layers pretty much separated, we can always go back later and hue shift. If something is too ruddy and we want to push it more towards yellow, we can do that just by hue shifting later. Here, this is just a picture of skin that I got off, I believe, 3ds K. And I'm pasting that down. And it's a real gross differential between pinks and yellows, so I'm bringing that on, scaling it up, and making an overlay out of this as well. So this is really, again, just about stacking overlays. Don't be afraid to just stack textures on, erase them out, and see what you get. I'm duplicating this by Control-Alt, clicking and dragging while I'm in the move brush there. It's just duplicating that, collapsing them down with Control-E. And then if I Control-click on the base layers, Control-Shift-I to invert that selection, I can delete the overspray. Now I definitely want to do some erasing and adjusting to this, so I'm going to select my eraser brush and erase out any areas that I feel are problematic here. Here I'm going to actually clone stamp. I'm going to clone stamp over some of these bad seams. So I'm just clone stamping those big broad areas of yellow that feel a bit awkward right there on the cheek, getting rid of those. And now I will dial back the saturation on that because it's a bit too saturated, a little too red. And now I'm using the eraser brush to erase out the areas that I feel are too bold right in the center of the face. So you can see that extra bit just adds some more splotchy ruddiness to the skin. Just erasing out areas that I don't need, and then saving. Always save your work. And here I'm saving as a composite file, just naming comp 01, 02, 03 as I go along. So at this stage we're going to start to use overlays to create a real dark variation towards the shoulders and the back of the character. So you've got a situation where it looks like the character is darker on his back than on his belly, which is something that's relatively common in the animal world, where you see something that's got a darker coloration on the back. I'm just grabbing another sample of skin, just one more with some interesting sort of moles and markings on it. This is again from 3D.sk. Adjusting the saturation and the lightness, and then just hitting that on top of the head and erasing out areas. Just basically try to punch up the sort of peachy, light skin tones of the character before I punch in the dark skin tones by selecting another one of these overlays of the moldy wall. I'm going to select this, copy and paste it on, and then I will darken it and dark down the saturation and the hue considerably, bringing this far more into a cyan and blue range than the others. So I want these to be a lot darker. So I've erased out the overspray, and now I'm erasing the belly or the chest and the face, and then again bringing up hue saturation, and I'm going to go to my color balance and again push it more towards cyan and blue, trying to make it considerably cooler and considerably darker than the skin tones we've had so far, and then just doubling it up by duplicating the layer, dialing down that saturation again, and you can see how we're creating a much darker mottled sort of texture pass along the rim of the character, along the back of the head and the shoulders, so it feels like this coloration is coming around from the back, and we're just erasing it out as it gets towards the center of the face. And I'm trying to erase it in sort of an interesting sort of pattern. I'm not just blanket erasing. I'm trying to add streaks or allow streaks of the color to come across from the back of the head, so it feels like a coloration that's pigmentation in the skin that's like might be some sort of camouflage. There we go, knocking back the values on that other overlay layer and then erasing it out, so we're getting the peachy tones of the underlayers at the center of the face, but retaining that real neat deep darkness in the ears and the back of the head and the shoulders. Erasing the tips of the ears out though, because we typically want those to be real warm. So setting that to overlay layer again, and I'm actually just scooting around the layer order here, adjusting my saturation. There we go. So I just duplicated the shadow layer and I brought it up to the top, just because I felt like the overlays were sort of evening things out a bit and I wanted to punch the shadows up. So I'm just setting that shadow layer up to the top, duplicating it, bringing it up to the top, and then just erasing out a bit just to make it a little bit more subtle. I'm really just trying to punch in the highlight and the shadow just so it doesn't go flat with all the overlays that I'm putting on top. I wanted to basically just punch in the light and shadow again, just to make it feel a bit bolder and clearer. So we're going to go into time-lapse again here while we play with these different overlays. And this is going to be variable on a case-by-case basis when you're painting, depending on the overlay images that you use and the order you put them down. You're just going to experiment with, stacking them on top of each other, duplicating them, adding more overlays. It's never going to be the same for every painting, but the generalized concept is always the same, where you just take texture images, put them down as overlays, and experiment with the blending mode, either overlay, hard light, soft light, and then erase out selectively. Now here I've created a new layer called blue, and I'm actually selecting a blue color, and then I'm using a very rough brush to actually paint this in, and I'm just trying to create a skin pattern along the outer border of the head and shoulders. Like I was saying before, I just wanted to feel like it's a darker color there. And that doesn't have to all come from overlays. Here I'm just selecting flat out a blue color and painting it on into an overlay layer. So it absolutely doesn't have to be coming from another image. You can just select colors and paint them in. Now at this stage I'm going to create a background, a fog background, like you've already seen in an earlier step. In the actual process of this painting, I didn't put that fog background in until a bit later, but I wanted to explain it earlier in the process of the text tutorial. Just create a new layer and call it Clouds, and then use the Filter Render Clouds plugin to put some clouds in there. And then I can actually, here I need to change my color selection to black and white so they're a bit more stark in contrast. I just move them above my gradient levels layer just so they're not lost in darkness entirely. Transpose, Control T to transform and then scale them up. And then I'll play around with my blending modes just to make them really sit in the background nicer. It's a very, very simple process to create that backdrop.